Okay, so in the previous video, we saw that sometimes plants might make extra tissue to try to basically hurt their neighbors, and sometimes they might not, and which is true is obviously going to depend on how expensive it is to do that and whether or not the benefits can support that. So what do plants actually do? So let's take a look at how plants allocate shoots under competition. So there's an experiment that's about 10 years old now, that these guys did, where they took a bunch of plants and they had different treatments like we have in lab. So you can see they had a greenhouse bench with all these circles are pots with plants in them, but most of the white ones are just there to cause shade, to just cause competition. So if you zoom in on any one of these treatments, what you'll see is the white pots are there just to cause competition, and their main treatments were control, that were the same height as all the white pots, lowered, which were lowered relative to the white pots, and lifted, which were lifted above the white pots. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to compare the heights of these different plants. And what they found was that the plants that were lifted were actually the shortest, and the plants that were lowered were actually the highest. So what these plants were doing was they were actually all basically trying to get to the same height to try to shade their neighbors. So the lowered plants had to work the hardest to get up to where the sun was, and the lifted plants had to work the least hard, and then they did. What's funny is that these guys actually interpreted this as the plants kind of cooperating, which I think is completely the wrong conclusion, that they were basically only growing as tall as they needed to shade their competitors. So it's pretty cool, right? These plants are doing the hawkweed strategy that we learned from the game theory. And so sometimes people like to know, well, how do plants do it? Well, we've already learned this in the plasticity lab. Remember, we had those cyan-colored cones that blocked red light, right? So, if you look at the color, the wavelengths of light in pure sunlight, you get all the colors of the rainbow, including some that humans can't see. If we look at light that's passed through a green leaf, we can see that they've basically removed all of the red and the blue for photosynthesis. They reflect some green, which is why plants look green to us, but they also reflect a huge amount of far red, infrared light that humans can't see. We can skip this autumnal leaf, but if you look at a shadow is really different from a building or something. It's got all the colors of the rainbow, just less of them, right? Because it's a little bit more dim. And so plants actually use the ratio of red to far red light, like we learned in lab, to tell if there's another plant that's taller than them. So if they detect light that's missing red light, they will grow taller than if they don't, on average. Not all plants do this, but many do, particularly trees, right? And so as we saw in lab, you can actually trick a plant into growing taller by just changing the wavelengths of light. So here's an example where rather than removing red light like we did in lab, they added red light or far red light by basically just putting film on a mirror next to these plants. And you can see that these are poplar. You can see that they made them significantly taller by reflecting red light at them. So what about underground? Do plants do the hawkweed strategy, or do they do the doveweed strategy? So one of the ways that people have looked at this is an even older paper, is they use these split root plants, where the idea is you can actually split the roots between two pots. So they're like fence sitting. They're sitting on the pot with their roots in both. So the idea is you could set up these plants that are either sharing two pots or owning two pots, if that makes sense. So with competition, without competition. And what they found was that under two different amounts of nutrients, so I think this is low nutrients and high nutrients, that the plants effectively doubled their root production in the presence of a neighbor. So above ground plants try to get tall and put leaves above their neighbors. Below ground plants try to make as many roots as they can to steal from their neighbors. Plants are mean. So how do they do this? This is one of those parts of science that actually nobody knows for sure. It's actually not completely understood. There are several hypotheses out there, and this is something that my lab actually works on. The best evidence right now suggests that it's probably chemicals that roots exude into the soil that are sometimes called root exudates. But it could also just be nutrient depletion. And there's one guy that thinks that plants are emitting and sensing electromagnetic signals, and he won't let this idea go, even though there's absolutely no evidence that this is true, right? So we can think about the scientific method. We have an observation that plants make extra roots in the presence of a neighbor. Not all species, but lots of them. And we could ask the question, how do they do it? And we can make these different hypotheses, right? So here's 3 hypotheses, and again, different experiments different hypotheses would require different experiments. So like I said, the best evidence comes right now from the idea that root exudates are involved. And so here's a picture of a root tip with some lateral roots emerging. And what you can see, or at least what this is supposed to be depicting, is the fact that plants are always just exuding tons and tons of chemicals from their roots into the soil. Just a huge diversity of sugars and acids and all kinds of different things that have a whole bunch of different purposes. Allelochemicals involved in allelopathy are one of those. And so Marina Semchenko and some of her students did this really cool experiment where they basically they had a plant growing in a pot, and they ran the water through the pot and collected that water. And then they basically just put it on one side of the plant, and then they put pure water on the other side. So what they were able to do was create this environment where half of it was getting root exudates and the other half was getting pure water. And what they were able to show was that these exudates actually increased the amount of roots that plants made if they were from the same species, but not if they were from a different species. And even more interestingly, they were able to take the same species from a different population, so not co-evolved, and the response went away. So it's a very locally adapted thing that plants seem to have. So this is what I mean right now, where this is an experiment that just came out a couple of years ago. I guess it's getting old now, but this is really the best evidence we have right now that it's probably root exudates. So the key sort of takeaway then is that game theory, in the same way that we can understand why some animals fight and some animals do a weird dance to win mates, game theory predicts that in general plants should over-allocate to tissues when they're competing. They should have stems, they should make more leaves, and they should make more roots, and that by increasing the production of all of these tissues, plants can maximize their competitive ability. Okay, so that's the sort of individual level responses that plants might have to competition. And so in the next video, we're going to talk about the sort of population level consequences of competition.